Now, believe it or not, Nintendo is an incredibly old company. They've been around for more than 120 years. It's crazy. Starting off selling playing cards, and as time went on they started to make games as well as consoles. And that's what they are known for now. But throughout the years they have also done a bunch of other things which aren't necessarily video game related. So let's have a look at the top 10 craziest things they have done, and believe me, some of these are really wild. Number 10. Now, almost all of us know about the game Donkey Kong. You know, that old one for the arcade systems? In this game, Donkey Kong was the pet gorilla of Mario, but he escapes and angrily carries Mario's girlfriend, Lady, to the top of a high construction site. He's then pursued by Mario and attacks him by throwing barrels and creating living fireballs. A bit of a weird setting, but that's not what this is about. Because there's one very special thing about this game, aside from the fact that it was the first time we ever saw Mario and Donkey Kong. They are original creations from Nintendo after all. The thing that's special is that Mario originally went by the name of Jumpman, which is a bit odd as you can imagine, especially since we know him as Mario now. Now, the reason why this was the case back in the day is because Mario was one of the first characters to ever actually jump up in a video game. Now, while this might sound pretty insane, it is true. Apparently, it wasn't really a thing back in those days. So the concept of a jumping guy scaling some sort of weird construction site was very impressive and new for them. So while it isn't too crazy nowadays, back then it was. And who knows what would have happened if people didn't end up liking the concept. Number 9. Now, Nintendo has also done some other crazy things throughout the years in their games, and this one is even crazy to some nowadays. Because in the first Mario Kart game for the SNES, they allowed some characters to do some silly things. Because the original Mario and Friends wacky racing game had characters like Bowser and Peach celebrate their victories by pulling out a bottle of champagne, and then they straight up started chugging the whole thing down, which is pretty damn nuts, even for today's standards. It was even so bad that in the American version it was altered that they didn't do that when they won. So basically the beautiful US of the A didn't like the heavy drinking idea in a children's game, and so it was removed. But in the Japanese version it's still 100% a thing. Pretty nuts when you think about it all. Number 8. Now for our next one, we will look at one thing I've mentioned before in another video, and it's actually pretty weird, because aside from making their fun little consoles, Nintendo was also actively looking towards the future, trying to predict it, because they were actively developing a phone at some point, which was revealed by Pocket Gamer. A development source who preferred to remain anonymous revealed that there was a skunkworks R&D project run by Nokia and Nintendo in the early 2000s. And about the same time, Nokia was working on the original N-Gage phone, which was this thing. In the end, the R&D efforts, which were located at Nintendo's Japanese headquarters, were successful enough that the concept of a Nintendo phone was taken to the company's board of directors for approval. And it was rejected. So in the end, it didn't happen. So all we got was the drawing from the patent and no real-life prototype at all. Still an interesting bit of history though. Number 7. Now, while Nintendo was one of the first gaming companies ever to do something with a phone, they were trying to innovate long before that. Even their first console had some features that seem quite outlandish, even for today's standards, although it was kind of cool as well. Now I'm talking about the Japanese version of the NES, also known as the Famicom, which actually had a microphone embedded into the controller. And believe it or not, the first Legend of Zelda game allowed you to kill certain enemies by shouting into the gamepad, which no one ever expected, not even the players. Although they did put something in the instruction manual. It stated that the Pole's voice enemy hated loud noises, which is a bit of a vague hint, and so no one ever thought about screaming at the microphone, if they even knew about that. Even if they did, then everyone around them most likely thought they were going crazy. So one thing we are learning from all of this is that Nintendo loves to be ahead of the curve, but 9 times out of 10 it doesn't work out that well. To be honest, it's a miracle that the Nintendo Switch worked so well from the very start, although there were still some minor problems with it. Number 6. Now, as some of you might know, I love the Game Boy. Aside from the Nintendo Switch, it's my favorite console of all time. And while the device and its many versions are certainly interesting, there's one little fact about it that's even more interesting. The Game Boy was actually invented by a nobody. Well, to be more specific, a normal guy who was doing maintenance on the assembly line in a Nintendo Hanafuda factory, which were those cards they made a long time ago. And this man's name was Gunpei Yokoi. One day, company president Yoriyoshi Hamiyauchi came around and noticed a toy that Yokoi had built in his spare time, an extending arm of sorts. That toy became the Ultra Hand, and it turned into a bestseller for the company. And so Yokoi moved from the assembly line to the design suite. And later on, he turned a boring old calculator into the Game & Watch, which was another huge bestseller. And then, he created the Game Boy, the crown jewel of handheld gaming devices. So obviously, always do your best while you're on the job, because something like this could happen to anyone. And if it never happened, we would have never seen the Game Boy. Number 5. Now, as you might notice by now, Nintendo has always been making games and toys, even before the days of the computer. And back in the day, they had a cool little idea. They made their own version of Legos. Way before their recent deal with the Lego company. This is another of those weird Nintendo ideas. Clearly, the brick system was called NMB blocks, and as you can imagine, Lego wasn't too pleased with all of this. But strangely enough, Nintendo managed to work past any legal difficulties due to the fact that some of its blocks were rounded. But in the end, the NMB blocks project was cancelled. But back in the 90s, they did make a reference to it in a game. Super Mario Land 2 6 Golden Coins. Here, an entire stage is made out of NMB blocks. So a lot of us have seen them, but never truly realized what it was we were looking at. I never knew about this, and I was quite shocked when I found out. Number 4. Now, another thing Nintendo loves is good PR for the company. So when the whole space race became a thing back in the day, they had to do something with it. Both Russia and the United States of America were busy with all kinds of space missions and walks, and a lot of people followed these developments. And so Nintendo came up with an interesting way to include one of their most popular consoles in these events, making their world-famous Game Boy the very first video game console to be played in space. And surprising enough, it wasn't an American. It was the Russian astronaut Alexander Serebrov, who was known for playing his Game Boy in the spacecraft, and the game in question was Tetris. And this was the first time ever that a video game was played in space, which most likely happened either in a space mission of 1989 or 93. Personally, I never knew about this, and I was especially surprised that it was a Russian, since the world was a bit shaky back then. Number 3. Now, like I mentioned before, Nintendo is really old, and actually started off making other products before video games, like playing cards. But throughout the years, they also made some other types of cards. And, to discuss these, I will have to use some, code words, just to make Papa YouTube happy. Because while the Hanafuda cards that they made were fun and all, they also tried to reach a more adult audience. Because at one point they also made some cards with spicy models on it, which people could collect. Now obviously this is really weird and unlike anything Nintendo has ever done, but in the end it did happen. However, this isn't even the weirdest thing they have done throughout the years. Number 2. Now aside from this adult stuff, Nintendo also loved making accessories for their consoles, and some of these really make no sense. For example, they made an attachment for the Game Boy that allowed you to take pictures, as well as actually print them. But there was one thing they wanted to sell that was even weirder than that. They were actually very close to releasing an accessory in-game that lets you make your own knitting patterns. But during its market research period, all 7 of the beta testers, died of old age, weirdly enough. And in the end, the project was abruptly cancelled. Maybe because of the beta testers, or maybe because they saw there was no market for it? Who knows? Number 1. Now for our number 1, which is by far the craziest and clearly a step up from the stuff we saw before. It's basically an even crazier idea than the spicy cards they made, because that wasn't the only adult thing Nintendo had ever done. Because one of Nintendo's mental business ideas was something called a love hotel. And no matter what you are thinking, the answer is yes. These are popular establishments in Japan that offer couples rooms by the hour for a fun time. And you can also do this with other women. They invested in such a hotel in the swinging 60s, however in the end the location and the name of this place was lost. So we don't know a whole lot about this grand business adventure. All we know is that it didn't turn out too well. And in the end, almost no one remembered that any of this ever happened. So clearly Nintendo has done some crazy things throughout the years. And now, all of you finally know about it.